Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will get started, as you've been so good as to be prompt in coming to join us this evening, and thank you for attending. I'm Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security here at the Institute, and welcome to this evening's discussion meeting on NATO, the North Atlantic and Maritime Strategy Back to the Future, ? Surveying the maritime scene at the moment, I'm tempted to the thought that never mind the South China Sea, the North Atlantic is back. And I think there is a bit of a sense with the dramatic change in the European security landscape and seascape. Suddenly we are focused on and talking about and thinking of things that have not really been in the forefront of discussion for an awful long time. Things like sea lines of communication, deterrence in the European context, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, and the North Atlantic generally. Now, in the context of all of that, and concerns about a re-emergence of Russian naval activity, the refrain has been that this is not a return to the Cold War, this is not the Cold War, there are sufficient differences. And yet there are also potentially, maybe, enough ripples from that time that we could learn some lessons from the past, or at least consider whether they have application now in the responses that we see now. And we have no better person really to kick off our discussion this evening than Professor Eric Grove. I'm sure probably doesn't need an introduction to pretty much anyone here, but I will say just a little bit about the fact that Eric is one of our preeminent naval historians and strategic commentators, and his insightful knowledge and his encyclopedic knowledge is complemented by, I think those of us who know him well would say, is also an infectious enthusiasm for his subject, for which we are all in debt. He, amongst other things, has written many books, but one in particular that is apposite for this evening, and that is a book entitled Battle for the Fields, which
very
is
cheap
there
on
before
Amazon.
you now.
And I don't get rolled.
In which he recounts in great and very effective detail, I suppose, what was the apogee of NATO maritime strategy and US and Western forward maritime strategy at the end of the 80s, on the last big NATO North Atlantic maritime exercise teamwork. He was 4 weeks at sea with NATO forces, and brings out many of the issues and thoughts and concepts and doctrine behind maritime strategy at the time and its impact, really. So I'm going to invite him to speak for about half an hour on his thoughts about that and the resonance that that might have for what we're thinking about this evening, and then we'll open it for discussion. So, Eric,
thank you very much, Nick, and thank you all for coming. I'm most flattered by the distinction of my audience. I've been thinking for some time that perhaps we ought to go back to the future and think a little bit about how NATO did think about deterring and, if necessary, fighting Russian naval forces in the Atlantic, and it deterred them by actually taking the initiative, by going forward. This was very explicit in the 1980s. As some of you will remember, there was this great debate about the maritime strategy, the new maritime strategy that the Americans were putting forward. And I must admit, at the start, I was a bit worried about it. It was considered to be somewhat dangerous. It was risky in the sense that it was putting assets at risk from being sunk by what seemed a very powerful Northern fleet at the time. It seemed to be provocative in that it might provoke the Russians into overreaction. It was considered, connected with that, somewhat escalatory. And also, and this was my problem with it to start with, it was unhistorical. There was, in the American iteration of it, there was this spots diagram of ships being sunk in the Atlantic, and sort of saying that, well, if we go forward, that won't happen. But I think what was being done by NATO for most of its history was to try to come up with a new concept of how you used a modern fleet to support the direct defence of shipping and diminish the attack on shipping to the maximum possible extent. And forward carrier operations, that were seen very much as the centrepiece of this maritime strategy, or one of them together with forward submarine operations, this idea wasn't new. It went right back to the start of the Atlantic Command in the early 50s. The idea of defending as far forward as possible, attacking the enemy at source perhaps, or again as far north as possible. And as the first Sacklant, Admiral McCormick, put it, there should be no purely defensive operational concept for operations in the Atlantic. So it meant forward operations in the Norwegian Sea, a threatening Soviet naval and naval air assets. This became clear, actually, in the first big exercise Mainbrace in 1952, when the idea was that Norway would be defended and the Soviet fleet would be destroyed. There were 2 carrier strike groups, four American and 2 UK carriers were in this exercise, plus an American light carrier. There was an anti-submarine warfare hunter group with another American escort carrier, the 2 first British Type 15 frigates as part of that. This made it clear that if there was a conflict, there would be a very important forward dimension to it, with the striking fleet, the NATO striking fleet, being a very key asset. At that time, plans were that by D+30, the striking fleet would consist of 6 fleet carriers, 2 battleships. May sound rather backward-looking, but actually at that time, the Soviets were building the Stalingrad-class 12-inch gun cruisers, and there was considerable concern that carriers, particularly at night, would not be able to deal with them. So therefore, you needed all big-gun ships. And as soon as the Stalingrads are cancelled, we get wind of that, and the battleships are taken out of service. It's actually quite interesting. 8 cruisers, 4 UK, 4 US, 36 destroyers no less, 15 British and 21 American, and submarines. And that would be the striking fleet at D+30. And the idea was it would go forward and take part in what at that time was going to be, well, perhaps a partially nuclear war and so on. As time went on, of course, then the strategy became much more nuclear, and the major role of the striking fleet was basically adding to the nuclear strike forces of the alliance. But this tended to change, of course, in the 1960s. Flexible response put more emphasis on conventional forces, especially on the flanks. In fact, MC 14.3 talks very much about the need for crisis management on the flanks, and this being an important area where conventional forces in general and maritime forces in particular would be very important. During the 60s, exercises began to reflect this change. Even before NATO adopted flexible response, the first teamwork exercise was held in 1964 on the northern flank. In 1967, Admiral Colbert, who was Deputy Chief of Plans in Sacklant, came forward with the idea of having maritime contingency forces under Sacklant's control that could be deployed early in a crisis. And this, of course, was the origin of Standing Naval Force Atlantic, later Standing Naval Force Med, and so on. The year after Colbert's, in fact, in 1968, Stanav Forland, as it used to be called, or Sniffle as it later became, was formed. There was there was the so-called Brassiere Study, named after the Secretary General at the time, and the idea of that was that that one should contain and destroy Soviet submarines as far forward as possible. This idea of a forward strategy. Carriers would support operations ashore, and the defence of shipping directly would be concerted with a serious offensive against the Soviet Navy to put the Russians on the defensive. And this was always, and this was, even in the nuclear age, one might say too, although things would be rather beyond that. This was always very important, that the other side had to be put on the defensive. A scenario was there in the Brassiere Study. There was warning. Carriers were sent into the Norwegian Sea. Barriers were also set up in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Convoy escorts were actually brought in too. So it wasn't just the forward strategy, but the forward strategy was a very important part in diminishing the level of the attack. As as I say, Soviet submarines were to be engaged as far forward as possible. The Soviet Naval Air Force was to be engaged, drawn out, and attacked. And Soviet submarines will be held back, protecting their own assets. And this began to be a feature of Western thinking, that in fact, if one mounted some kind of offensive as close to the Soviet Union as seemed practical, then the Soviets would have to hold back their forces. They thought they could do it in the late 60s, but they were worried that it might not be the case in the 70s, given current trends. And in the 1970s, there was a period when it was the end of the Vietnam War. There was a certain loss of confidence, shall we say. People began to put much greater stress on what some call the Maginot Line in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, rather than moving forces forward. And indeed, in one exercise about that time, there was. In fact, in 78, the exercise scenario was to regain control of southern Norway rather than hang on to it. But the trend was changing in the late 70s. The times were changing. There was a major study in 1977 started that led to the adoption of the first concept of maritime operations, CONMAROPS, in 1980. And this got DPC approval in 1981. This set out 5 campaigns that would actually provide the context for naval planning in the 1980s, the last decade of the Cold War. There was the Norwegian Sea Campaign, the Atlantic Lifelines Campaign, the Shallow Seas Campaign, the Mediterranean Lifelines Campaign, and the Eastern Mediterranean Campaign. And the 3 operational principles governing all of these campaigns were containment, defence in depth, and keeping the initiative. Those were the 3 vital operational principles. By Teamwork 80, the carriers were back in the Norwegian Sea. And in 1983, Sacklant, then Admiral Wesley MacDonald, talked about containment by offensive actions to keep the Soviet Navy focused and on these, and to get them to focus on defending their activities in Norway and the Barents Sea in 1984. Carry the fight to the enemy, deny the Soviets any kind of sanctuary, threaten key elements of their warfighting strategy in home waters. It all sounded rather sort of gung-ho, but in fact the whole idea was to try to make the Russians feel they could not surge out into the Atlantic and use their assets directly against shipping. If they did, they'd be taking enormous risks. Teamwork 84, very big exercise, 150 ships, 300 aircraft, and one can see the emphasis changing to again back to if you're going to fight a conventional phase of operations, then you needed to deploy forward. And put the enemy on the defensive, and get perhaps what the Americans called war termination leverage. This NATO work and NATO exercises was going on in parallel with American national developments. The formation the writing by Stan Weeks and Wes Johnson of the first iteration of the maritime strategy, and it went together with CONMAROPS. There was a kind of synergy between the maritime strategy and CONMAROPS. CONMAROPS was revised in 85 and again in 88 in a direction which was similar to the development of American national thinking. The structure of striking fleet was changed in the 80s. There was the striking force, the anti-submarine warfare striking force, as anti-submarine group 2, which had been called once we could no longer produce a carrier strike group 2, an amphibious striking force. And this was shown in Ocean Safari when the USS America went into Vestfjord for the first time, a sort of bastion area for the American carrier force, supported by Admiral Oswald, I think it was, in the ASW striking force. What was interesting about some of these exercises in the 80s was that the carrier went forward even if there wasn't going to be an amphibious landing. In the Northern Wedding exercise, the carrier was there to help support the operations taking place to make sure reinforcement could cross the Atlantic. So these forward operations were in fact a vitally important part of maintaining sea control. In Northern Wedding, in Ocean Safari 87, the pattern grew of putting carriers into fjords. The idea had come both from an American study and indeed from a British study, which had helped lead to putting the ships into San Carlos and the Falklands War, thinking that in fact if you want to protect yourself from air attack, being surrounded by mountains isn't such a bad idea. I described the other thinking in my book, and if you'll forgive me, I think we have time, I can quote it. What has been evolved, and this was written, remember, in 88-89, over the last few years, is a clear pattern of operating NATO's major fleet assets close inshore to the Norwegian coast. As Admiral Larsen made clear both in his words and acts in 1987, there was no Vestfjord strategy, but a strategy of forward defence, requiring, if need be, the ability to operate and fight in and near the fjords. As stated above, exploiting geography gives the striking fleet a number of highly significant advantages. The high mountains of northern Norway give considerable cover from enemy sensors and make targets hard to find, let alone engage. Air attackers face the difficult choice of crossing Norway's defended airspace, or that of Sweden, or swinging the long way around North Cape, giving good warning and thus enhancing the defenders' chances of a successful outcome to the outer air battle. If enemy aircraft arrive over the mountains, they have the near impossible task of trying to find anything and are forced to search for high-value targets, creating multiple shooting opportunities for the defenders' missiles. Standoff missile attack is even more difficult, if not impossible, and defending forces can be concentrated on any possible longer-range threat axes, for example, against missile-launching bombers attempting shots up the length of the fjord from the open sea. Anti-submarine forces can also be concentrated around and off the fjord mouth to provide defence in depth against missile and long-range torpedo attack. Submarines would find it difficult to get past these defences, and mining can also be used to protect the striking fleet in its bastion. All this depends on successful precursor operations by surface and air forces to clear the main fleet's operating area before it arrives. Finding enemy submarines against the jagged bottom contours, complex water movements, and in the ever-changing temperature and salinity gradients of the fjords is very difficult. We found that out in the USS Haler as we sort of went around sounding like a whale with our active sonar pinging and not being able to find much under the pinnacles. The Norwegians were extremely good at hiding. But the enemy submarine captain is perhaps even worse off. He has to use passive sonar and his only non-detectable sensor, and in the difficult conditions, this can rarely produce reliable enough information. The bad water works both ways. He therefore has to use his periscope or some other mast, and this greatly increases his chances of being attacked, either by the precursor forces or, if he survives that long, the close escort of the carrier battle group. One can argue that going into the fjords allows the striking fleet commander to have a high degree of confidence that a fleet in those days of three carrier battle groups, they'd come down by one, would be sufficient rather than four to carry out the vital tasks of bottling up the Soviet Northern Fleet and creating such a threat at a Soviet basis that the Northern Fleet's air and submarine assets will be drawn into a battle in which the NATO forces have all the inherent advantages of the defender. The fjord option is such a good one because it exploits all the advantages of the defensive form of war. Admiral Mustin, its founder, would probably be shocked to realise this, as he was always a prophet of the offensive. Mustin quite rightly regarded that his forces insisted that his forces operated tactically with an offensive spirit at all times. But at the operational and strategic level, he tended to confuse the initiative with the offensive. Early forward movement to powerful defensive positions, threatening the enemy's bases and communications, positions which the enemy ignores only at great peril, and which he will thus be drawn into attacking under unfavourable conditions for himself, is, as Clausewitz long ago pointed out, a classic strategic a manoeuvre with a long pedigree. And I go on to say that, in fact, Corbett would very much have approved of this, that, in fact, you take up a position which the enemy has to attack, and you therefore engage him on favourable terms. So that roughly was the thinking at the end of the 80s. And one wonders, in fact, how far that kind of thinking is relevant today. True, the Northern Fleet is not so powerful as it was, thankfully. About a dozen operational SSNs and SSGNs, about half a dozen operational SSKs. Of course, there are the SSBNs. And the SSBNs are very important here. And this, of course, is one of the most controversial features of the old maritime strategy with a big M and a big S. Did you unleash your SSNs against the SSBNs? Well, certainly threatening them was important because, as was pointed out, not quite in this room, but in the IISS, I think towards the end of the 70s, work was done to show that, in fact, by the Centre for Naval Analyses, Jamie McConnell comes to mind, that in fact the Soviets were adopting a pro-submarine strategy, that in fact protecting their SSBNs gave them something that they wished to defend at sea. This was the major strategic reserve, nuclear strategic reserve, and therefore their SSNs were something that had to be defended. So threatening them, the assumption being that sinking the odd one wouldn't necessarily force them to go nuclear, would in fact have an important effect in drawing back the Soviet surface navy and aircraft to help prevent that attack being any more successful. And I think there's something in this idea, actually. In fact, one reason the Soviets went in for these helicopter cruisers and this kind of thing was that they were adopting a kind of limited sea control strategy. It wasn't sea denial so much anymore. It was actually protecting their SSBNs. And working on that perception, as picked up by the Naval War College, was a very important part of the development of the further development, you might say, of the forward maritime strategy. Surface forces, of course, much less powerful than they were. One carrier, one Slava-class cruiser, about half a dozen guided missile destroyers, a couple of frigates if they're in service yet, and strike aviation is much diminished. I've been coming across references to the Northern Fleet's 45th Air and Air Defence Army, which, as I said, I couldn't find in the military balance. Whether that's the Northern Fleet's aircraft redesignated, or it's a new Arctic-centred air defence army which is being formed, quite a lot of ground-to-air missiles deployed, etc. But the fact that the air defences are very strong around the Cola, or beginning to be strong, means that what Admiral Oswald the late used to call Cola bashing is not necessarily a very good idea. That in fact going after the enemy in his bases is not necessarily a very good idea. What you need to do is to draw the enemy out so you can engage him. Now with only a dozen or so fences, that's rather different from the regimental attacks that one used to face. But if for example, the Russians reinforced their aircraft up there, it could have a certain logic to it, and the F-18. The FA-18 with AMRAAM, and also there was an interesting article in Proceedings a month or two ago of the utility of the F-35B in the counter-air battle. That there is talk of getting some kind of electronic connection with Aegis and this kind of thing to actually enhance air defences. So the F-35B AMRAAM combination could get us back a little to the old days of the F-14 Phoenix, where you take on aircraft at very long range. Now, I admit that the Russian missiles are getting more sophisticated, etc. And there's a lot of talk, of course, particularly in the Far East, about anti-access area denial, etc. But on the other hand, the anti-access area denial capacity of the Soviet Northern Fleet was pretty powerful at the times I'm talking about. And having some idea of how you can engage it on favourable circumstances, under favourable circumstances, is an important factor. So, perhaps I should be talking about this to the NATO Naval and Striking Support Force in Lisbon, which of course has taken over the command functions, the old Sackland and Striking Fleet command functions. But I think the main point is this, that NATO's strategy was never wholly reactive. It came close to it in the 1970s, but it never quite got there. It wasn't just escorting convoys, and of course in 1981, when when Mr. Knott, as he was then, went over to Norfolk, and found that he was being told a rather different story from that he was being told in London by the naval staff. It demonstrated that perhaps the old idea of, in a sense, just escorting convoys was not the case. But of course it never had been the case, really. Using the striking fleet as an asset to put the other side on the defensive was in fact always a very important part of NATO's maritime strategy. And perhaps we can learn something here. The balance of force now is probably, potentially at least, more favourable to us than it was then. Now, I know there are only two and a half aircraft carriers a year, and so on, and perhaps the deployability, and the deployment of US carriers is actually is quite low. I think our own carrier, with the air group it will get, probably or possibly 1 British and 2 American squadrons, would be a tremendous asset. We might be back to a situation, if the Americans can rustle up a couple of carriers in the Atlantic, to 2 British and 1 American carrier, back to the 3. So in fact we're talking about figures which were considered credible against much more powerful Soviet forces. So perhaps we shouldn't be too put off by the significant A2AD capabilities that the Soviets can deploy. They're much less significant than they used to be, said he provocatively. And I think that the same principles could well be used that we had in the 80s to actually put the Russians on the defensive. And the idea, in fact, was also to use these forces very much in a deterrent and crisis management role. The whole idea of moving what you had forward relatively quickly was to demonstrate commitment, to protect northern Norway, to do something to actually maintain control of the Atlantic if the balloon went up, and you hope the balloon wouldn't. If the Russians carried out an early offensive against American carriers, well, that itself would be a tremendous escalation if American carriers were actually going to be sunk. And therefore, the dangers of doing that would be very, very considerable. And I must admit, as a kind of born-again maritime strategy man, as I said, I was rather against it to start with, but I came very much in favour of it as time went on. It suddenly seemed to make a great deal of sense. And I think it might make sense if we look back at these events, at these forces, at these principles, at these ideas for the proactive use of what still remains significant Western naval power, despite all the cutbacks, as the best way of preventing the Russians attacking northern Norway, or perhaps even, as they might still consider, with their limited submarine force, doing something significant beyond the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. We still have, and I honestly don't know, we now know what SOSUS was, but there are still a lot of surveillance of Russian submarines, which of course is one reason why we moved away from convoys, because you could actually direct assets against submarines. You knew where they were. And this of course gives us a great advantage too. In an overall defensive campaign, taking the initiative is very important. Now, how far we can apply those kinds of principles in other areas is an interesting point. The Baltic would be very interesting. After all, one of the scenarios for the Queen Elizabeth was actually moving a carrier into the Baltic to protect a large Eastern European ally against an even larger European country. So the Baltic is somewhere where perhaps the same principles could apply. I remember speaking at IISS conference about, do these principles apply in the Mediterranean? An interesting thought. But I think that the whole lesson is be proactive, take the initiative, and use forward operations to draw the potential enemy out if he wants to come and fight. And if you do that with Aegis ships electronically interlocked with F-35s, with the kind of air defences that we now have, and the kind of ASW capacity that we ought to have. And of course, one important point is this, and perhaps it's vital. In Teamwork 88, the striking fleet and its other and the other NATO forces did much better in Vestfjord than they had done in previous years. They actually found targets and, for exercise, sank them. They hadn't done that in previous years because they hadn't been used to the environment. And this is where training is absolutely vital. The training ground, has to be the potential battleground. And I think that we need to pay much more attention, or even more attention, to actually working out how we potentially fight in these areas. If Norway is going to be completely secure, and if we want a relatively effective way of maintaining lines of communication in the Atlantic, the other side has to be put on the back foot, and that was the essence of what the Forward Maritime Strategy was all about. At that point, I'll stop.
Eric, thank you very much for that. A masterful voyage down the decades of NATO maritime strategy, reminding us that actually the sense of a forward maritime strategy was not just a last minute dying days of the Cold War afterthought to some extent, but had much longer antecedents, but also bringing it up to date and posing the questions. And you clearly have your own view of this as to why not now in some ways at least as a deterrent. I'm going to open it to questions, and I'll ask those of you who would like to pose a question A, to catch my eye, but B, to identify yourselves for the courtesy of all present when you ask your question and you'll make your comment. I'm going to use the privilege of the chair to just pick up your final strand of thoughts on now, and your sense, as you say, in some ways, looking at where we are now, there's a bit of a sense of there's this anti-access area denial thing out there that is just too hard a nut to crack, and yet in some ways the balance of forces might not seem any less favourable than it was at the end of the Cold War, and yet there is a bit of a sense that the potency now of offensive weapons are such that, and the numbers are so small on the side of, say, the alliance in some respects. Yes, the Northern Fleet isn't what it was, but the numbers are so small. Doesn't that actually change the character of the calculation in some way, that you just can't afford to? Well,
the more I've thought about this, the more I've thought that perhaps not necessarily. It depends on your attitude. After all, some of the missiles are the same. AS4s are still in service, and the numbers of aircraft available are much less, much smaller. I don't think we should be fazed by this, if you see what I mean. I think that if we can get our act together in terms of integration of defences. In fact, actually, this was the first year, I think, that they used what was then called JOTS, which was a way in which you could find out where all the other ships are. I was amazed by this. It was the first I'd seen it in '88. But that kind of thing, integrating your defensive forces, your air assets, and so on together, you can, in fact, think of taking on what aircraft are deployed against you by this 45th Air Force or the Northern Fleet or whatever, with some degree of success. And in fact, it's probably better to draw him out than to actually attack him in his bases. So I think that yes, one must be cautious, but the numbers of carriers actually are not hugely different. The Americans came down from 4 to 3. Now, if we're lucky, there might be 1.5 or 2 or something. So, in fact, the numbers are not hugely different. And an aircraft carrier is meant to go into harm's way and fight the enemy when it's attacked. Battle of the Philippine Sea.
Great. Gentleman in the front row.
Samir Puri, lecturer at King's College London, War Studies. I wanted to pick up your theme about transferring your insights to some other maritime theatres. You mentioned the Baltic, you mentioned the Mediterranean. I actually wanted to ask you specifically about the Black Sea. In particular, thinking after the annexation of Crimea, obviously the Russians were leasing the base anyway, so it's not as if they've acquired it out of thin air. But from the perspective of Romania as a NATO member, thinking about some of these principles of maritime defence in relation to the Black Sea, do any of these insights transfer, or is it just too far into Russia's backyard for it to be sort of relevant in that sort of thinking?
Well, I think there's no harm in taking the initiative. Of course, there are problems in using aircraft carriers, and of course, land-based areas. But I should have said with Phil here that of course all this is integrated, with land-based air as well. One could conceive of surface action groups operating in the Black Sea and putting at risk Russian assets. and forcing. Basically, the key to this is put the Russians on the defensive. Don't let the Russians think that they have a free ride, and this would require some reinforcement, I suppose, through the Straits. And of course, there's the Montreux Convention and everything. But I thought it was interesting, actually, in the Georgia crisis, that the Americans sent the Blue Ridge, because the combination of the Blue Ridge and an Aegis destroyer actually said to the Russians, look, if you continue bombing things, we can mount some kind of defence. It was interesting, actually, that in the Ruckus meeting shortly afterwards, the Blue Ridge came and the Russians were shown what she could actually do. So, in fact, having a NATO maritime operation in the Black Sea, serviced by the local allies, as far as they can, with the support of American surface forces, with air support from the land. Again, if you integrated that, you could get something that was quite strong. But the issue of the Turks, are certainly very important. The Turks, of course, have very considerable maritime assets now, and air assets, if they can be kept on side. If you want to keep them on side, but that's a whole different ball game.
Sir.
Good evening, thank you. My name's Charlie Stifford. I'm a veteran of teamwork 1988.
Are you, Joe? What were you in?
I was on the King of Prawns in a landing craft.
Oh, were you? I see, right.
And I'm an ex-commander of 3 Commander Brigade.
Yes.
You've given a very seaward-facing,
I know,
anti-air warfare, anti-submarine warfare,
yes,
carrier-centric view. So I'd be very grateful if you could explore competition on the land.
Oh, yes, on the land. Well,
from a reassure, contain, and contest. Noting that 2 MEB have actually kit in Norway in caves ready to go, and I'd just be interested in seeing your view on the amphibiosity and their contribution to maritime constitution to joint operations.
Thank you for bringing that in, because I probably did neglect it, because the point I was trying to make was the carriers went into the fields even if there wasn't a marine landing. Yes, crucial part of most of these exercises was landing marines. Both ours and the Dutch and the Americans. Although it's surprising, actually, the Americans don't actually land until 1972. Actually, is the first landing. But yes, I mean, bringing troops ashore to help protect northern Norway undercover and supporting them from the sea was a vitally important part of everything I've been talking about. So retaining an amphibious capacity. Now, of course, at the beginning of the 80s, as a sort of hangover from some of the doubts of the 70s, it was decided that we'd send the Marines to northern Norway where their training could be exploited by air. Hence the decision to withdraw Fearless and Intrepid, which thankfully was reversed for a number of reasons. So, yes, I mean, having an amphibious capacity is very, very important. I mean, one gets the impression at the moment, of course, that in fact the poor old Royal Marines are under attack from 2 directions. From the people from the dark blue who want to use their personnel to sort of flesh out the ship's companies of the aircraft carriers, and from the army, who, as usual, want to destroy the Royal Marines on principle. But I've always argued, and continue to argue, that having an amphibious capacity which can be landed relatively early in a crisis, and the special training of the forces and the UK NL amphibious force, etc., 4-5 Commando and so on, this is a vitally important part of deterrence, particularly as the land threat isn't as great as it used to be.
Thank you for that.
A significant though it is. No. I would argue very strongly for the maintenance of amphibious shipping, for the maintenance of the special training of the Royal Marines, and I think there ought to be another way of getting the extra 500 men.
I wish we could get you off the fence sometimes. Lord West.
Yes, Admiral West, previous Commairs W. Strifor.
Yes, that's right.
Director of Intelligence, Commander in Chief, and First Sea Lord. I'm interested in the maritime strategy in the 80s.
Yes.
Because I think there was more behind it than this. It was quite a change. And it also fitted in with Reagan,
it did,
Lehman,
yes, that's true.
The 600-ship Navy, the whole Star Wars initiative. They were putting the squeeze on the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
And it was quite clear that Striking Fleet it was made quite clear that Striking Fleet was going up there to attack the Kola.
Or to threaten the Kola.
Well, threaten the Kola, but that followed on. Threaten if you're fighting, you suddenly start doing it, and also the bastions as well.
Yes.
And the whole submarine emphasis was on that as well. So it was very, very sort of controversial. If you remember, the European NATO nations, apart from the UK, said they wouldn't support forces going up north of Iceland when this started. It was only the UK that did it, and ASW Strifor, we sort of thought we've got to go in front of the American striking fleet,
yes.
because the American striking fleet, particularly the carriers, sort of just basically didn't know anything about submarines and would steam on a steady course for about 45 minutes doing their launches with green grenades going off all around them.
Absolutely right. Always a problem. Always a problem.
So that, I think that impetus, it seemed more of that impetus than the previous plans of putting on the back foot and things. It was almost aimed at making them go broke, in a sense. Because the Soviet Union, as far as I was aware at that time, started realising they could not actually keep up and afford to counter that, plus all the other things that were going on. So I sort of see it more as that. And can I just throw in one other thing?
Yes.
The Royal Navy has never attacked the Royal Marines. I spent half my life defending the Royal Marines.
Well, I know.
Amphibiosity is absolutely crucial, but if you've got no money at all, and as I always say to Michael Fallon, if you've got no ships, it's very difficult to swim anywhere. And you have to have ships if you're going to do amphibious warfare, if you're going to have a navy. And the reason is because we're hollowing out defence, there's no bloody money, there aren't enough people, and the Navy are being in very difficult choices. Sorry, I had to throw
No. I agree with all that, actually, and to some extent I say it in here. But the point I was trying to make was that, in fact, it wasn't completely outrageous in terms of the way NATO had been planning to fight previously. Yes, in the 70s, things had got... I have a map in here called The Doubts of the 70s, and now I understand the codes that people like Jim Eberly were using when he came to Dartmouth and talked about this, about Maginot Line mentality and so on. This idea, even in the late 70s, that all we could do was to try to regain southern Norway and not keep it. And as part of... But even in the late 70s, people were beginning to change minds, and you have this parallel development of NATO thinking and American thinking. And the American thinking affected the NATO thinking, naturally. And it became much more proactive, much more assertive. And yes, it was meant to worry the Russians, and it did. Good thing too. But, it wasn't, and I know it was very controversial, as I said at the start, but it wasn't in a sense such a hugely new development as people tended to argue.
I understand that, but it was, because of that 70s period, it was actually quite a...
It was quite a change, yes, absolutely.
It was a shock in
Brussels. Absolutely.
They couldn't believe that, because, as you said, and you said you initially were concerned about it.
Yes, I was.
It was seen as being very, very...
Yes, it was.
Striking.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks. Sir.
Stuart McDonald, Ministry of Defence Policy. I'm intrigued by how we get Allied consensus on a more assertive, offensive maritime approach, because there will be a sense of loss of mojo, not least with the loss of capability over the recent decades, but also a sense that the vulnerability of the assets we have, fewer in number, as you conceded, and also, are there any lessons we can draw from what the US has learned in the Asia Pacific? The rebalance of the Asia Pacific, A2AD threat with China. Are there lessons there?
Well, I think, in the Asia Pacific, of course, if you're coming in, sort of say, over the open ocean, and you're subject to attack from everything from Dongfeng 29Bs to jet fighters with anti-ship missiles, then you are in potentially a slightly difficult position, and you need to be able to sort of try to get some kinds of assets that will knock out the missiles and this kind of... And you're in a very big conflict. I think the whole idea of the fjords was this, that in fact, as I tried to explain, that in fact you use geography to help protect you from the A2AD, although nobody called it that threat at that time. You use geography to maximise your assets. And although numbers have come down, and if the engines get fixed eventually, Type 45 will be an extremely effective air defence asset, which can engage multiple targets at longer range. And this together with Aegis. Now, integrating Type 45 with Aegis completely is an interesting concept. Completely. Because, and with F-35. But that could make a very formidable air defence system. I agree the politics of this could be difficult. The Germans might not like it very much these days. And so the Norwegians might like it, although they probably wouldn't say it too stridently. Because the Norwegians always liked it, because they were much more concerned about being abandoned. Because they saw themselves in the late 70s, quite rightly actually, as behind the defensive line. And in fact, converting to a more forward strategy again was a very important reassurance to them, despite all much talk of the Nordic balance and this kind of thing. So I think the A2AD problem might be different in the Pacific from what it is in northern waters, if we look again at some of the ideas that were around in the late 80s. Because I was, as I explained in the bit I mentioned to you, this was very much using the defensive form of war. In my introduction to Corbett, I mentioned the Maritime Strategy in 1988, that this was a very interesting idea of doing exactly what Corbett says. Go to a position where the enemy has to attack you and defend under favourable conditions. And that's exactly what the Fjord strategy was. And it worked then, or it may have worked, it probably would have worked. We never, although we exercised it, exercises are always a bit artificial, or a lot artificial. Nonetheless, it seemed to me a very good concept, because equally it demonstrated that we weren't out on a mad rush to the Kola Peninsula, which some of the critics said was the essence of the maritime strategy. Instead, we were actually going to set up bastions close to Russia, with the potential for an attack, and the Russians would have to worry about it. And if they worried about it, they would probably try and do something against it, but under favourable conditions for us. The use of geography as something favourable, as something that could be exploited by forces that were not considered to be more than adequate at best, at that time even.
One of the added political complications now on the NATO front is there's this sort of north-south divide, though, isn't there? I mean, there was a sense of a common consensus on the enemy and scale of the threat before, but it's almost, dare one say, two-speed at the moment. There is a northern consensus around concerns about Russia. The Mediterranean, there's a very different perception of what the threats are.
And there tends to be, and actually having the sort of strike force headquarters in Lisbon tells you something about emphasis in a sense.
Who knows how how command structures will evolve, both maybe here and in NATO in the months ahead. But Ian Thompson.
David Nicholas, sorry.
I'll beg your pardon.
David Nicholas from the staff of the House of Commons. All of the questions I wanted to ask all been touched and answered very well, so I'll restrict myself to, first of all, could you say a little bit more about the role of RN, submarine operations under IISS?
Yeah.
Specifically, and whether we still have the capability to go about that sort of role. My understanding is that hasn't been done for quite some time, that may be wrong. The second point was, actually, I think Nick might have just addressed about NATO and maritime command structure, whether you think the various changes and iterations of command structure that happened in the last 20 years have made it more difficult to go about this kind of alliance strategy that we've been discussing. And lastly, importance of airborne anti-submarine warfare capability.
Okay, fine, lovely. As far as NATO command structures are concerned, I think probably my answer would be yes, actually. Of course, we don't have a SACLANT anymore. It became innovation and so on, and for good reasons at the time. But the command structure that we had was very much suited, and as refined, was very much suited to fighting some kind of maritime engagement. I think with the strategic emphases we've had more recently, perhaps we need to keep looking at our command structures and to get something a little like the old SACLANT and so on, and the striking fleet, and etc., or at least a contingency force or something. As regards submarines, yes, very interesting. Yes, submarines did play a very important part in the forward operations thing. This became more obvious in the 1980s, but it was always there. And operations forward, operations off the Kola Peninsula, and indeed operations under the ice to threaten the typhoons, and even before then, were actually extremely important parts of the overall strategy, although they weren't emphasised to the same extent for obvious reasons. I don't know about operations under the ice. Alan, can you help us on that?
The answer is we haven't really been practising very much recently, but having known how to do it, we could do it again. I think the real problem we have is we will end up with 7 SSMs. The minimum.
Exactly.
We knew the minimum we could ever work with was 8. But the government somehow seemed to have forgotten that. None of the work and policy work that said we should have 8 has gone away. So that's a real problem.
Exactly.
And I think the other thing was, part of the reason that the Typhoons went under the ice was if you think we were going to have 16 SSNs at one stage, by the sort of late 70s, early 80s, I think there was a real danger, actually, of... You said that the Russians could afford to lose 1 or 2 ballistic missiles.
Well, that was our idea, anyway.
Well, I think they were beginning to see that slightly differently, because
yes,
they felt that the American first strike could be so accurate. That's why they did let their train-launched ICBMs and other things, because they began to feel that we were beginning to get such information on the planes, then there might even be the dreadful situation where every BN of theirs at sea had a tail sitting with it.
Yes.
And that's what they were really worried about. That's why they went under the ice. As I say, I don't think we've practiced that recently very much. And I don't think we're in that position again. But those were very worrying.
Yes, but it's the old story, isn't it? We have to start training. We have to start training in the theatre, where we'll operate, and we're only really just starting on that. But it's something that we need to do, and this goes for submarines. Airborne anti-submarine warfare, very important. I always say that the one thing a submarine commander is really scared of, even though he won't admit it, is a dipping sonar helicopter. And certainly MPA, dipping sonar helicopter, and also things like AEW helicopters, radar flooding areas, were very useful ways of keeping submarines down. And of course, a submarine that is kept down, particularly a conventional submarine, is a submarine that isn't half so effective. Yes, certainly in the 80s that was the case, and it still is now. And scrapping the MPA was almost as bad as scrapping the carriers.
And in a sense, you talk about those are skills you lost.
Yes.
As Commerce W. Strike4, we held down 2 Victors for 72 hours.
I'm sure you did.
Using maritime patrol aircraft, dipping sonars. First time we used active sonar buoys because we weren't allowed to use those because they frequencies away.
Yes.
We felt by then that it collapsed. This was a problem, so we could do it. We were able to do that.
I know. I agree. Of course.
Carriers. We haven't practiced that sort of thing.
Of course.
For a long time.
That's a good point.
And again,
thank you for that. Yes, no, I agree entirely. When I joined Illustrious, this is my old salty story now. When I joined Illustrious, which was Admiral White's ship heading the ASW striking force, and I was allowed to see all the plot and everything, and it was quite remarkable. There were a bunch of submarines transmitting at Russian levels for the time, Soviet levels for the time, and we had an asset over each of them. There was either a helicopter or an MPA, or both. So if the balloon went up, their life would be very Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, what was also interesting was that when we went to a different phase of the exercise, were they still doing grey-green exercises as part of the exercises then, rather than blue-orange?
I honestly can't remember.
Because these are when the two sides operate with Western standards of quietness and so on and tactics. It was to hone each side's tactics, and we had a wonderful battle in the Greenland ice and UK gap against Standing Naval Force Atlantic, playing a Soviet surface action group. We were actually engaging with missiles at close range. I don't think it was very realistic. But what was interesting about the prelude to that was that as the Western submarines switched off their transmitters to make them sound like Russian ones, they all disappeared off the plot. Now, how far modern Russian submarines, like the Severodvinsk, for example, can have that capability is a very interesting point. And I don't know the answer to it, although they are somewhat quiet. Though she is somewhat quieter. So yes, I mean with the proper training and the equipment, even in your day, Alan, we were able to deal with the Victor 3 threat and so on, and deal with Russian submarines. But that is something which needs training and honing of skills as much as it needs technology. I would argue.
Could I just add a bit?
Yes, please.
On the maritime, because he was asking about the Far East as well. The maritime patrol aircraft are crucial to the Americans in the Far East. I mean, the Chinese now begin to operate out the second island chain. They used to stay at the first island chain. Yes. They're out the second island chain now. Their submarines, nuclear submarines, used to be so noisy. Ours used to pop up and hold their ears because it was so bloody noisy. They're actually getting quieter, and they have an immense number of conventional boats. And the American worry is we ought to kill the submarines quickly enough to allow the carriers to get inside the second island to do the fighting that they're meant to be doing in their war plans out there. So the maritime patrol aircraft
is crucial.
Very, very crucial.
And not forgetting that Japan has 70 maritime
Absolutely.
patrol aircraft, whereas we're going after 9. Thank you again, Lord West, and apologies, David, for confusing you and your colleague. We've got a couple more questions. We're coming to the end of the time, so I'll ask Jeremy Stocker and then my colleague Ben Barry.
Yeah, thank you. Eric, I was struck the way that you typified the maritime strategy going forward and putting pressure on the Soviets increasingly in the mid to late 80s. Because we now know more than we did at the time about what their intentions were, there was actually a remarkable congruence, because they increasingly were focusing closer to home anyway, because what had previously impelled them forward was the limited range of their offensive ballistic and cruise missiles. They had to go forward to bring useful targets within range. As they got much longer range,
That's right, absolutely.
they were happy, they wanted to pull back anyway, so there was almost a coincidence of purpose there. And we now know that the Okean exercises in the 70s and what followed on from them were very much focused about peacetime demonstrations and exercising peacetime influence. They were picking up on making the peacetime influence of naval force, but in ways that had very little to do with how they would have fought a war, because they recognised, probably more than we did, that projecting their task groups hundreds, thousands of miles away from their bases looked jolly good in peacetime, but in wartime they were not sensible acts of war. And I wonder if we're seeing that again now, is that as the resurgent, albeit diminished, Russian Navy goes more in for worldwide deployments and flag showing task group operations further afield, whether we're seeing a resurgence of that is for peacetime demonstrative purposes, but actually in terms of warfighting they will still be as focused in what we now call an A2AD type of strategy in the areas of sea close to the motherland, which is what they're really interested in if they think they're going to be in a fighting war. And therefore maybe we've got to repeat this dichotomy between what they do in peacetime and what they expect to have to do in wartime.
Quite possible. Quite possible.
Because there are actually three questions on my list. Ben Barry and then Gordon Wilson.
I'm the land warfare expert here, and I can assure you that we think amphibious forces have an increasing utility in the world, even though there's some formidable A2AD challenges that they might have to overcome in some areas.
So do I.
Just a couple of thoughts. The bastion in the complicated coastal terrain, it's going to be a lot more effective actually if it's a joint bastion. You've got land-based air defence, land-based coastal defences. My final thought is land and air forces have changed an awful lot in the last 15 years because they've been fighting wars. Many of the changes are of enduring utility, particularly unmanned, autonomous and robotic systems. And it seems to me this has potentially revolutionary effects on both sides, including the ability of a ship to be in more than one place at once. Have you any thoughts about how that's going to change Cold War redux?
And finally, just one last question, Gordon.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Gordon Wilson, a Belarusian member here.
Former naval person.
Yes. Eric, you haven't mentioned much about the Russian philosophy point of view. You've done it from the perspective, a Western perspective, right? And if you look at their concerns, they are with the former territory of the Soviet Union, the states that are formed out of that, plus NATO's expansion to Eastern Europe. So you mentioned in one of your comments about an exercise with a former big country in Europe, obviously Poland. And I think Norway is less an area of for aggression than it was perhaps in the past. Therefore, your comment about being into the Baltic and also your comment, there was a question about going perhaps into the Black Sea as well, are very, very germane. Would you put your carriers in there necessarily? How do you cope with the Kaliningrad problem, which is a problem for us, but also is vulnerable to the Russian interest if we chose to really be aggressive there? And is it more confined in what sort of submarines will you find pattern in the Baltic? Probably just conventional.
Quite. Yes.
So, I mean,
It would certainly be be a challenge, and I was surprised actually way back in 1998 that in fact this was an important factor in the decision on the aircraft carrier, and in fact it was an argument that the naval people who I knew actually in the meeting won, which much to the surprise of the civil servant chairman, because he couldn't quite believe it. Well, perhaps it was incredible, but I don't know. But it was certainly a factor. Yes, I mean, I think that the dynamic. I wasn't asked to talk about this. Perhaps a later occasion. The dynamics of some kind of Baltic campaign would be actually quite interesting, to say the least. And again, the Russians have got their vulnerabilities, and the balance of risk that we would take to actually exploit them is something that would require careful consideration. But a significant maritime force could operate, I think, in the Baltic and could take on the Russian forces with some chance of success. I think the importance is the integration of the forces and this kind of thing, and the point about land and air forces is very well taken. I mean, this was always the aspect. I mean, in the exercises of the 1980s, Norwegian land-based F-16s, American F-15s, B-52s, you name it. They were all part of the operations and integrated. And I think that this is perhaps even more important now than it was then. Especially as we now can integrate them, perhaps in theory at least, a little more easily than in the past because of modern comms and electronics, etc. Now, what was the third point?
Well, there was unmanned and robotics.
Unmanned and robotics, yes.
Game changers, and then the sort of
that's right.
Peace diplomacy versus.
Yes, I think that. Well, of course, the forward exercises. Teamwork 88 itself was a peacetime demonstration of what might be done, and it was done to exploit known Russian concerns. We've been getting more and more convinced that the Russians were worried about the security of their plabs, their SSBNs, as soon as SSN-8 came into service and they could hold them back. And as I said, I remember in the previous IISS building, a very interesting briefing on this idea of pro-submarine warfare. And of course, Gorshkov talks about this in the Sea Power in the State as well. So there was a peacetime and deterrent aspect to this, as well as a potential warfighting one. And the emphasis always was on deterrence. Uninhabited systems. It's an interesting thought, actually. If we do begin to replace manned aircraft with uninhabited systems, will that make attacking the enemy in his bases, or potential enemy in his bases, that much easier because you aren't losing pilots? It's a thought. I'm not sure. But yes, I mean, uninhabited systems for mine countermeasures, very important. And mine countermeasures, and it was interesting actually, one of the lessons of Teamwork 88 was that the mine countermeasures capacity required to help the striking fleet get into Westfjord wasn't as great as it might have been. It's a point I make in the book. And having the capacity to operate in these conditions is something that is important. And uninhabited platforms have a very important part to play. But my final point is this. This can all be put in a context of traditional maritime strategy, particularly Julian Corbett. That in fact, the basic principles of maritime warfare don't alter very much. The technology you carry it out with alters a great deal. But certainly the framework that we get from traditional maritime strategy, as applied by the Americans and their allies in the 80s, with some political difficulties with the other allies. These, I think, remain very important and should give us some guidance as to how we deal with a resurgent Russian navy.
Can I just make...
Please.
There was a throwing line about land and air have been fighting wars. I think that's one of the most dangerous things that's happened to us, is that we have not been fighting a peer-to-peer war. And one can see in the way that... for example, rear areas are looked after, the way certain aspects of communications go on, the loss of the fact that you don't expect anything to be lost, no attrition, nothing going. I think it is bloody dangerous because, particularly in the air world, they have not been fighting someone who is comparable in air-to-air fighting. And actually, in the land world, that doesn't mean it's not been unpleasant, nasty stuff. But fighting a counter-terrorist war in Central Asia is not the same as fighting the Third Shock Army in Europe. And I think we've got to be very, very wary about that, because I think we can be lulled in a very poor sense of security.
Thank you, Lord West, for that and for your insights and your point. Actually, in the Institute, we are doing a lot of work precisely on the fact that across the domains we are now facing, potentially peer competitors, which mean that the whole domain and the entire battle space is contested in a way that it hasn't been for some time. So thank you for your interventions, but particularly thank you, the rest of you, for coming this evening, and for those of you who also made interventions and asked questions. But my particular thanks to Professor Grove, who has done his usual fine performance of being able to look at the historical perspective, but also put an awful lot of meat on a bone that everyone is gnawing at the moment. And for that, and for I think what's been a stimulating evening, I'd like you all in the traditional way to thank him for his